we are really pleased to welcome Louis, who has a long history with Toulouse, the University of Toulouse, and we are really glad that you accept to participate to this closing panel of Corpus Africana. We're already a little late on our schedule, so I will let Louis begin his talk. Thank you, Louis.
Thank you, Norman. Merci beaucoup, Norman. Hello, hello, bonjour. Shalom, salam alaikum. Aussi, je suis Jamaican, so how you keeping? And can you understand me okay? Good. I speak this morning and with Norman this afternoon. So this morning will be a brief introduction to some themes. So we begin. I will first tap. You got that? Now, when I tapped, I actually did 2 bars of what's called 7/4 meter. 1, 2, 3, all right, so let me do it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay? Now, why did I do 7 2 times? And this is a bit of a music lesson. See, you can count 7 in many ways. You could do it as 4 and 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. You see? Or you could do it 3 and 4. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. Or you could do it 5 and 2. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2. Now, the question, was it different each time? And that is interesting, because although I just tapped it, when I counted each time, we, the room, we brought something to it, okay? And when we bring something to it, that affects reality. In fact, what I just demonstrated in philosophy is called a transcendental argument, okay? And what we bring to it affects not just what we hear, but reality. I could do 7 this way. But it's still. There is a world that makes you, most of us, only think in 2s and 3s. So for instance, in the period of colonialism, in the period of Euro-modernity, to think is to think like this. Or a waltz. That, unfortunately, is European man. Now, that wasn't always European man. We think of African humanity. Or we could think of Punjab humanity. If you slow that up, you know what that is? Reggae. And of course, there are people who are told, no, rationality is. But as we know, some people did this. We know that as we try to impose a narrow way of hearing and feeling, nevertheless, there's the human spirit to assert freedom. So I begin with this because what I'm going to do this morning is to outline some fallacies, some mistakes, some misrepresentation. Because many of us, unfortunately, have been fed or offered a way of thinking that's like this. Instead of the possibilities that are out there. And I don't just mean 7. Some people could think this way. That was in 11. Now imagine the many ways we can think if we could open our rhythmic hearts. So I begin first with a falsehood. The falsehood is that to think is to think as a European. And in fact, I had a conversation with my colleague this morning where, will be one of the speakers later, where the belief is that theory, ideas, thinking are not only European, but white. And that the world of experience, feeling, rhythm is black and dark. But the truth is, both are distortions. There was a time when Europeans danced, many still do. And there are always been people in the rest of the world thinking. Bless you. What created this belief? Well, the short answer is colonialism. But to say that isn't to say much, because people don't think about what colonialism is. So, first we begin with this. If you think that your only experience and the other group is only theory and rationality, you must deal with the problem that everybody struggles with their experience. The struggle is the experience of figuring out your experience. And when you go to figure it out, you bring a theory, meaning, interpretation to experience. But if you think the only people who could interpret are the people who have dominated you, then when you go to them, you are going to find out that in fact you make their experiences the correct experiences because they use their experience to develop their theory. So even though you may say you prioritize your experience, when you say theory, theory must only be Foucault, Derrida, Hegel, Marx, Kant, Descartes. You in fact say that their experience is more important than yours. And you notice I only named men. It happens with women too. There are women who do feminist theory through only Foucault, Derrida, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche. They don't think of Pitzon, Wollstonecraft, Cooper, Beauvoir, They don't think in terms of Hepshet, or even the complexity of Shelley, Nefertiti, and more. And this is crucial, because if we fail to do that, we say only one group of people think, and everybody else just have experience. It is so bad that people believe, and I'm going to talk about briefly Africana philosophy, there are people who don't even believe that Africa is an African word. In fact, when you look up words, you often go to dictionaries that point to Latin or Greek. If you always go back to Latin or Greek, eventually you think that the only people who thought in the ancient world were Latin or Greek, or Romans or Greeks. What was the rest of the world thinking? In fact, the idea is the rest of the world, let's pick Africa. Africa, in that view, is and then this bad history makes one day the African steps on future European soil, because remember, there didn't used to be a Europe. Europe is a creation. So they step on the soil of the Peloponnesus or Sicily, or work their way up to what would be future Germany. And they say, thank God that's over. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. I can think. I am. But Africa is in fact an African word. So I'm going to introduce you to a language called Metu Neter. Metu Neter is an ancient African language, older than most European languages. In fact, probably all of the ones we know today. In Metu Neter, there's a word called Ha. Ha is the foundation word for the word Chai in Hebrew, and it means, Ha means womb. It also means life. Okay? And Africa simply means to come from the womb, to come from the cradle of life. It was the language spoken from what would be today parts of Sudan all the way up to Egypt. East African. And many words, intellectual words we have today are from that language. Believe it or not. Okay? But the problem is we keep stopping when we go to Latin and Greek. So we don't ask, where did those words come from? And that's because we've been taught that there were no words before those words. Yet, if we begin to look at these, we begin to learn that something happened to language similar to what happened in biology. You see, in the past, not the distant past, but I'm talking about racist past, which is pretty much the present, the idea was that white people and black people and Asian people are so different, they had to have different origins. You see? But genetics has proven that false. We all are descended from Africans. Okay? We call it today African, but people from Africa. Well, in language, if they didn't have it biologically, the next move was to do it culturally. And so the idea was to say, even if we're all from the same ancestors biologically, our culture had different origin, you see? And so we created a fiction, not we, they. The fiction is the Indo-European. And thus, the idea was a special group of people. Nobody, by the way, has ever found an ancient Indo-European tribe. It's a complete fiction, okay? And that the idea was those languages are unique, the African languages are different, each one is different. The problem is, when you study the ancient languages, you find out they're connected. There's more connection. As a consequence, if we pick important words, we find that their oldest roots tend to be African. Some words, though, have no roots in Africa. And it's for a simple reason. The concepts did not exist yet. Okay? So this is not to valorize or romanticize Africa. Its point is a simple one, which is that we need to decolonize how we think not only about the past, but how we understand the present. So, I'll begin first with a concept that we need to understand because it comes out of what we call epistemic or knowledge colonization. Okay? And the thing about epistemic or knowledge colonization is that it is connected to the process that close off how we see and think. Bonjour, Jean-Christophe. It's good to see you. So, the first one I'm going to bring up is theory. Many people today don't know, sad to say, what a theory is. Most people think to do theory is to talk about theorists. So many, instead of talking about a theoretical idea, would simply bring up a theorist, black, white, or brown. They could bring up Fanon, they could bring up Foucault, they could bring up an American like John Rawls, they could bring up Lucia Regay, they could bring up an East Indian like Sir Aurobindo, or a Japanese thinker like Nishitani. They will bring up the theorist, and then they articulate or they say a position. But a position is not a theory. Okay? And so the question is, why do people tend to bring up theory and a position instead of do a theory? And the answer is because intelligence has become a commodity. It's a nice way of saying you're more marketable if people think you're smart. And people think theorists are smart. In effect, this move to present the marketable is part of the colonization. Because you see, in what I'm going to talk about, this colonization is at work not just with the historical material power, but the relationship that builds that power. Okay? And I must add, I am not against power, okay? part of the colonization is to misrepresent power. So, where theory becomes marketable, the discipline that in its essence is theoretical becomes marketable. And that discipline is philosophy. And because philosophy becomes such, it is rewritten into the logic of colonialism. Here is an example. Every one of you may have been taught that philosophy began in Athens 2,500 years ago. In other words, philosophy is Greek. If you ask people why, what do you mean? Why? They will say philosophy is a Greek word. Isn't that what they usually say? They would say philosophia. It's the phi is pronounced like that. Phi. It's not really soft. The problem is that Sophia is not historically Greek. Sophia is the Greek way of using an African word. The African word was Sabaeat. Sabaeat in Metu Neter means wise teachings, but its root is Sa. Now here's what's interesting. I don't think any of you in this room can name in your language, if it's French or English or German or Spanish, more than 3 or 4 words for wisdom. In Metu Neter, there were more than 36 words for knowledge and wisdom. And the reason is that older languages don't have the luxury of economy. So wisdom would be not just an abstraction, it would be different kinds of wisdom. You see? So the root word sa, and another version, sai, that's just one example, was built on to create words. So for instance, Saba, Sab, Sai, Sa, Sait, they're all related to words we use today. One form of wisdom was to know when conditions have been met. Sait, it survives today in the word satisfy. Satisfaction. You will find in Portuguese sabo, you notice a lot of those words sa, but the Greeks pronounced the b sound f. So Sabea became Safea, became Sophia. Do you understand? And so the love of Sophia, of wisdom, became associated with Greek, but not in ancient Greece. That idea is Euro-modern. In fact, if you're interested, write me. I could reference ancient text. Here is one. There was a philosopher by the name of Antef. Antef wrote 4,000 years ago, not 2,500 years ago, 4,000 years ago. Antef wrote that a philosopher is a person dedicated to wise learning, to ancient texts. Now think about it. Antef is 4,000 years ago, and he wrote about ancient texts. So there are books that are even older. He talked about the person who seeks knowledge and is wiser than a sage. You see the word sage? It has sa in it. You see? He argues that it's a person who knows what she or he doesn't know through learning. And I translated a version of it. I could give you the text. You could write me. I will share my email. But here is the point. There were many writers. Hatshepsut, that's a woman philosopher. In that society, there were women philosophers. And there are others I could mention, Hotep and more. And even among ancient Greeks, there were others, cynics, who were female philosophers. When you go to the museum and you look at ancient Africa, whether it's Egypt or Nubia, you see women writing. It's interesting, people don't ask, what were they writing? They presume men write, but women and men wrote. And some of us who could read hieroglyphs or hieroglyphics, sometimes it says what they were writing. Do you see what I'm getting at? And many of you don't know, for instance, writings on monotheism by Akhenaten were shared because they wrote together by Nefertiti. We think of Nefertiti simply as a beautiful woman. I mean, that's what her name means. Nefer means beautiful. But she was also a thinker. And this is crucial. Crucial. Because as I speak, I'm bringing things the way I tapped to thinking that I hope you could find useful. And so what happened to erase this? There were two things. The first was the emergence of Christianity. Christianity was brutal. We have a good history of Christianity because Christians told the history. But actual ancient Christians burnt temples, libraries. The ideology was misogynistic. They killed women philosophers. They burnt down, destroyed many of these books, and created a world in which permitted thinking was Christian. Then, as we know, Islam emerged, and Islam was different, early Islam. But then, when another movement emerged, which was Atlantic trade, they were Christian-oriented and needed to find a classical path, but the problem was most of the books were destroyed. Not only that, they had an ideology that was male, and it was a future around being Christian, and as a consequence, they began to create a path while they were creating an economy. And so capitalism plus secular Christianity created something new. And this is important because this something new has with it a view that misrepresents certain concepts. The first concept is market. Humanity has had markets for more than 100,000 years. You notice I said markets, plural. Markets were very human practices. We traded ideas, tools, communities, learned. But in the period from the 15th century onward, the idea was to treat the human being as a problem. Salut, bless you. Encore. And so this problem needed to be to be pushed down, and a new concept, the market, emerged. The market is an abstraction like a god. And so the problem for the market was human beings. The idea was that if you could shift it and not have a market for people, but people for the market, it would be more efficient. As a consequence, look at how we speak today. The historic sites that analyze markets are now subordinate to the market. We don't talk about knowledge of the market. We talk about the market of knowledge. We don't talk about how God or religion, right, can assess the market. We talk about the market of religion, the market of God. Same with education. We don't talk about, we talk about the academic market, right? Politics. Not that we change from politics controlling markets to the market of politics. And the list goes on. And that's why part of the enslavement of humanity has been the market colonization of people. So when I talked about theory, that's what I meant. Instead of the theory of the market, the marketing of theory affects how we talk about theory. Okay? Now, the next one is modern. You see, Christianity plus capitalism created what we call, I call, Euro-modern racism. Because the market needed an anthropology. It needed a subject. But the market, as I just described the market, must have no limits. Thus, it needed a subject that had no limits. Do you understand? Well, I have a colleague here who did a wonderful discussion on the concept of whiteness. And whiteness emerged in this moment because what individual people are who we call white is not what I'm talking about. Individually, everyone in this room who is white, only know yourself as a human being, individually. But white as a group, as a category, is a subject of Euro-modern capitalism. And that subject is the subject that must have no limit. As a consequence, that whiteness is to have everything. And that's why it's linked to imperialism and colonialism. Non-white just want to get through the day, just want to have food, shelter, a life. And when you don't think of yourself as white, that's what you want. You see? What everybody wants. But here's the thing, to have everything means also to be the only source of knowledge, the only source of wisdom, the only source of science, the only source of art, ideas. The same thing to modern, the same thing that happened to philosophy happened to modern. Most people say modern is European. They refer to the word modus, means present. But and then they point out that the concept is from the 19th century. The problem with that is, how then is Descartes modern? Descartes wasn't born in the 19th century. How is Spinoza, Leibniz, Hume, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, how are they modern? Well, Hegel was, made his way into the 19th, but how are they modern? The answer is because modern is not really about being European, but racism makes modern white and European. This is what modern is. To be present means to belong also to the future. When you try to grab the present, it always passes. If you properly belong to the future makes your present legitimate. If your present is legitimate, then your past becomes the important past. And those who don't belong to the future, they become illegitimate, so their past becomes not important. This is crucial because it means there's never been one modern. There has been many moderns. The moderns of the past were wherever humanity thought the future was going. You see? So if you're in Nigeria and there's Yoruba land or Igbo land, that would be modern. If you were in Assyria, that would be modern. If you were in Kemet, which is the right name for ancient Egypt, Egypt is the Greek name. The African name was Kemet. That was modern. If you were in Rome, that was modern. If you were in the Mali Empire, that was modern. If you were in the Aztecs, modern. However, when one modern clashes with another modern, they look at each other and say, who is the future? You see? And so when we today treat modern as white and European, what we're really saying is to belong to the future is to become white and European. You see? But that is Euro-modern. Because, you see, it's not true that non-European people are passive. It is not true that people stop thinking and that they fail to build a future. And in fact, this leads to a conflict that creates four important invisibilities that are linked to decolonization. Okay? In other words, they're colonizing invisibilities. The first one is the philosophical anthropology of race. Racial invisibility is always about quantity. If you think about it, in France, people don't like to talk about race, but when they do, if you say black, or if you were to say Asian, or if you use terms like Arab, the obsession is always with numbers. How many are there? Okay? And when people are racially subordinated, the belief is they're always having too many children. There are always too many of them in a room. Always too many. In fact, this room is very mixed, which makes this a very dangerous room for a racist. Okay? I have many examples of this, but I only have a few more minutes. But I've been in many experiences. The presumption is all you need to make a room mix is to just have one person of color. Okay? And it's funny, in some places, if the room is 10% of color, it's not even called mixed, it's called colored. You see? And that's because the logic of whiteness is pure, because pure means all. You see? So that's back to what I said. The second one is on indigenous. The indigenous one is around time, temporality. That's because settler societies, colonization, says we have it, the indigenous people belong to the past, and the people who colonize them belong to the future. This makes indigenous people, if they're still around, ghosts. You see? But the problem, of course, in making the people ghosts is the lie of conquest. Many indigenous people use the language invasion, which means they're still fighting. And that means if they're fighting, they belong to the future. Of course, the future they belong to is a very different future than their past, which means a different kind of indigenous people would emerge. And, okay? And so we come to the third. A third kind of invisibility is highly political. All of these are political, but this one especially. But it's uniquely political because in European society and in Asian society, the anthropology it points to is gender. In other words, it mostly connects to women. And that is the invisibility of voice. European society in antiquity, even when you look at Christianity, if you look at is the idea that women could make sounds, but you shouldn't listen to women. And if you look at women's writing, lots of women's writing have the word voice in them. In her voice, finding a voice. Anna Julia Cooper, the black woman feminist philosopher, a voice from the South. Book of Chinese writing, in their voice. You got it? The reason this is important is because voice is essential for political power. And so, in effect, colonization is about disempowering. And so, voicelessness is crucial for colonization. The last connects all three. And that is, if you must not be seen, there are too many of you. If you belong to the past, you have no future. And if you must shut up, you must have no voice, then your knowledge becomes invisible. So the colonization has those four kinds of invisibility. There are others, but those four. And it means then, and this is important, there's a theorist, her name is Catherine Walsh. She wrote an article called Decoloniality 4. And what she argues is that it's not just about decolonization, getting rid of those invisibility, but it's about understanding that if you build something for, you are positing a future, which means that there's a different kind of modern to think through, one in which not only women, but it's crucial, it's mostly women, where people have a voice, where there are never too many of one kind of people because people belong in the world, they exist, where there's a sense of a future. And it means then, if it's about getting rid of disempowerment, it means we have to have a positive view to power. But power is not coercive power in this sense. Power is the opening up of the relationships through which human beings can actually create new possibility. And this is crucial because if we could create new possibility, it means that the human beings to come may be different from the human beings we know. And this requires a unique political commitment through which those generations will have a voice. But it means understanding that our knowledge, what we produce, although it will be the foundations of a future to come, it is also something that we must not fetishize or make into gods the way we have capitalism, Christianity, race, etc. So, as I started, it means that although the world imposed upon us is this and this, we have the potential to build more. Thank you.